Good morning, everyone. It's Pastor Shannyn, and we are in the fifth week of Lent. This week, we've got two major texts one from Ezekiel with dry bones, where we hear about God breathing breath into the dry bones. And we have the story of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11. And those are the two main passages that I'm going to be focusing on for today. As I think about preaching for this weekend, I haven't started my sermon. It's only Wednesday morning. um, but we just had a really good Bible study and we talked about these different texts and talked about what are some of the implications for preaching, what are some of the thought processes in our daily life, and how are they connecting. And one of the things that is interesting about how these texts come together is that they're paired with each other. So Ezekiel with the dry bones and God bringing life back in, not only with bones and sinew and flesh, but also with breath, is sits right next to our reading from John chapter 11 with the raising of Lazarus. And so the two are meant to tie together and are meant to intertwine. Uh, Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones coming to life is offered alongside the stories of death and life with Lazarus. And so the passage from Ezekiel actually comes to us again on Pentecost, and it is usually used on the Easter Vigil. We're not having an Easter Vigil this year, but it is one of the texts that's often used for that. And the reason it's used for Pentecost is because this reading from Ezekiel talks about the breath. The Hebrew word is ruah. And so even as you say that ruah, it takes a lot of breath to even say it. And that Hebrew word ruah is the word that is used for spirit or the Holy Spirit. It's the word used for breath. It's the word used for life. It's the word used for wind. It is all there's a number of meanings to this word ruah. And so when God breathes life in, it's ruah. It's the breath of life. It is the spirit coming into you. And so I've been thinking about that. It draws us back to Genesis 2 when God breathed life into dust and we became human. It's the ruah that is breathed into us in our baptism. It's the word and the spirit that is in the water that makes it holy and that continues to give us new life. It is the ruah, the spirit that dwells within us as we live our lives day to day, and it's the ruah that gives us life as our sin dies, and every day we are given a new palate. Every day we are given new life. We are given new breath. And so as you read this passage from Ezekiel, keep in mind the breath of life and the grace that comes with it, because in this passage, the prophet is, fairly pessimistic actually about human goodness. And I think that's somewhere where we sit a lot. That's one of the things I've been hearing quite a bit is just frustration over human goodness, and where do we see that, or where do we not see it, or how are we struggling with ourselves, or being self-critical, or being hard on ourselves and hard on other people, and having a lack of grace for each other. That is a really big struggle and a really big difficulty with understanding right now. And has been for years. I mean, shoot, it takes us back to the ancient scriptures where they still struggled with that. So this is nothing new. But one of the things that I've been hearing too quite a bit is about busyness and about stress and about worrying, about fulfilling commitments or doing the right thing or feeling guilty. And so I did write the notes of faith for this month actually after I read the Ezekiel text. And one of the things that I want to remind you is to be gentle with yourself. Give yourself time to rest. Give yourself Sabbath time to just be. Give yourself time to breathe in that ruah and just spend some moments with God, knowing that the judgment you put on yourself is not the judgment that God puts on you. And there's a really wonderful quote that I found that goes along with this text, and it says, only grace fills the gap between what we are made for and what we ourselves can manage. Hear that again. Only grace fills the gap between what we are made for and what we ourselves can manage. When I read that, that kind of stuck in my brain because I'm thinking about using that as part of the sermon or using it within the sermon. But it's important to remember that Ezekiel in this passage discovers the divine grace. The grace that is initiated with the whole human enterprise of humans from dust and breathing them into dust, breathing ruah into, breathing that life in. And God chooses to give us this life. It's so important to remember that everything is from God to us. We don't earn it. And it's not logical and it's difficult to understand that type of grace. But, God gives you that grace. God gives you that life and that breath and that pause and that filling of the Spirit deep within you, into your soul and into your lungs and, into all of you. And if God takes the initiative and God's Spirit brings new life and God breathes into dry bones, think about your bones. Think about the tiredness that you may feel or the pressure that you may feel. And remember that breath that is breathed into you by God. And allow that grace to settle over you. I know that at this time of year it gets stressful and there's a lot going on and we really want sunshine and we really want summer and we want to be able to get out and about. And so it all kind of compounds. So I encourage you to read this text and to hear that gospel in the midst of our Old Testament reading and to hear the grace that is being breathed over you and in you by God as you're gentle with yourself. Because that does give you new life. And that does take us into the John 11 text. And one of the things that there's a focus on is as you read it or as you hear it, you'll hear Jesus say, "Unbind him and let him go." Unbind him and let him go. So Lazarus has died, and Jesus Jesus gets word that Lazarus is dying, that he's sick, and instead he's actually very close by. He's only within a couple of miles, and he doesn't go there right away to see his friend Lazarus. And it's thought that Mary and Martha and Lazarus were very, very close friends of Jesus. So upon hearing that one of your best friends is dying, don't you think that you would go there? Well, Jesus didn't. He waited a few days. And so when he got there, Mary and Martha are pretty peeved. They're fairly upset that Jesus didn't come sooner. And so, they're like, "Hey, if you had been here, our brother wouldn't have died." And they say with a little contempt because they're sad and they're grieving and they're frustrated. And but what's interesting is at that time it was thought that the spirit lingered in the body for 3 days. And so Jesus didn't arrive until after that because he wanted to show the power of God. Lazarus was dead. Like, he was dead. Like, there was no spirit or breath or anything left in him. He was as dry could be with dry bones. And Jesus called him out of death. And so it's also foreshadowing his death and resurrection. Lazarus very, very much foreshadows that. And so it's not a mistake that this text comes to us 2 weeks before Holy Week, where we hear about Jesus' own death and resurrection. But anyway, getting back to the unbinding. So Jesus weeps, and we see the extreme emotion. And this story is such a great parallel between Jesus as man and Jesus as divine God, because we see the human emotions and the emotions that we ourselves have felt in time of grief. He weeps. And when you're weeping, Jesus is weeping right there with you. And when you're celebrating, Jesus is celebrating with you. But Jesus knows all of the human emotions because he is fully man. But he is also fully God. And so it's such a prime example of the human and the divine, the weeping yet the rising, the coming to us and yet moved by us, the calling us out of our tombs. And so again, sorry, I went off on a little tangent, but coming back to the unbinding. So Jesus raises Lazarus, and he says to the people around him, "Unbind him and let him go." And I think one of the things that shows is that Jesus does God's work of resurrection. Jesus does God's work of giving new life, of bringing life back into us. And yet there's also the piece where the mourners need to do their part, where they unbind him and let him go. the life has already been given, but the unbinding is done by the people. So think about that in your life. Think about, where do you need life being breathed into you, but where are you being bound? Or what binds you? What do you need to unbind? What do you need to let go so that you can fully live into this? If Lazarus was risen and he tripped over his bindings, and fell flat on his face, yeah, he'd still be alive, but he'd be flat on his face. So that gives us that idea to think of, what is it that we bind ourselves with? Do we bind ourselves with our schedule? Do we bind ourselves with harshness? Do we bind ourselves with judgment? Do we bind ourselves with not being gentle or not resting or, so many other things? We're really, really good at mucking up God's grace. We're really good at knowing that God gives us grace and then saying, oh, but, I only deserve it if, or I can only live into it if. No, it's always first and foremost God to you. God gives you this grace. We ourselves bind ourselves and trip ourselves up and hold ourselves back. And so think about that, how we can help one another unbind and let ourselves go, to live into that full grace, to live into the breath of new life, to live in the intentions of the divinity that God gives us. And I think so I think those verses really tie well together with that, of the new life that's giving to us, that's breathed into us. So this week, my prayer for you is that you remember that breath. And so pause and take some very deep breaths, allowing that ruha to come through you. And then letting go of the things that you need to let go of. Be gentle with yourself. Remember that you are a beloved child of God, and that God does not bind you. God lets you go. Blessings to you this week, and we will see you this weekend in worship. Take care. Bye-bye.